to record this so I can share it with my geopath students in the future, if it's okay with you, Dr. Keane?
Yeah, no, that's fine. Sounds good.
Does anyone have objections to that? All right. Okay, thanks. So welcome everyone, and welcome Chris.
Okay. So appreciate the opportunity. I'm just going to switch over to my slides. So let me know when that has synced up.
Yep.
All right.
I can see it.
Terrific. So pleased to have this opportunity to talk to you. I'm here with the American Geosciences Institute. We're a federation of societies, including groups like Geological Society of America and AGU and the like. And part of my portfolio is our workforce program, which has been tracking geoscience employment and academia since the 1950s. And one of the big things that we've been looking at over the last couple of years is the student to workforce transition, the skills that are needed, because one of the key things that we're definitely discovering is that the nature of work in geoscience is changing. And part of that, I'm part of a project that NSF funded project on vision and change for undergraduate education in geoscience, which we'll be publishing a book on. It's been over 1,000 people have contributed into this about how the curriculum and the skills and the way work is changing is moving forward. So some of this presentation is reflecting of some of that information that's coming out. Let's see, let me just get there we go. So, what I'm going to do is sort of talk through some of the skills, some of the things that we're seeing become important. I'd say we're getting some clarity about ways for students to think about that migration from being a student and into the profession, as well as sort of a deeper dive into one specific skill area, so you can sort of see how this all connects. So I think one of the first things that has been a conversation is, as a student coming out, are you just a degree holder, or is your intention to be a professional? So one of my colleagues at University of Texas, has commented that, probably 35% of their graduates in the geology program, they met all the requirements, but they really shouldn't be a practicing geologist. They don't really actually have the full skill set and aptitude. And that's fine. There are many people that use the degree to go on to other things, but it's understanding what your goals are. And so, as you think about entering as a profession, it's including things like that degree-based knowledge, but is also demonstrating that you know how to apply that knowledge. And then the other key things, and you'll find this, it doesn't matter whether you're interested in going into academia, government, private sector, becoming a faculty member, even going to grad school, excellent communication skills and social skills are really necessary. Science is actually a people process, even though I'm probably like a lot of dusty geologists and sort of liked getting in here because it was sort of seemed to be solitary, but it really isn't. And some of the key things that we hear from employers, and if you go on to grad school, is important, obviously, is project management. Doing a senior thesis, this is a good way, and has been demonstrated as a good method to start learning some of those processes and demonstrating that you've had that experience. Business acumen, again, doesn't matter if you just want to be a researcher. It takes money to do science, whether it's getting a grant from NSF or helping market a product or a service for a company that you're working with, or to defend a budget in a government agency. So you can't just leave that behind. You have to sort of build out through it. And then I think the most important thing that we've really looked at is that ability to learn. If you learn something new every day, you're probably going to be pretty successful. So what this really means is when we think about, as we think about that transition, you have your formal education process. You're getting your bachelor's or your master's or PhD, whatever, and then your professional employment may be that ultimate goal. But like it or not, there are going to be gaps in that, and a lot of it is in those applied skills that the employer is looking for you to be able to use, and then it's sort of bolstered by some of these professionalism issues, ethics, business, communications, as well as depending the area you're looking at, say licensure, regulatory issues, things like that. And a good employer is going to recognize that there's this gap, and they're going to help facilitate that. A good prospective employee, graduate, is going to have been doing co-curricular activities to try to fill some of these in, and we'll talk about that a little bit. You do always run into the risk, the famous, we need a entry-level position with 5 years experience in a field that's only existed for 2 years. And you need to be aware, if you're looking at employment and you're seeing jobs like that, that's an employer that hasn't really thought through what that reality is. And so part of our conversation isn't just talking to departments and to students and faculty, but also to the employers to make sure they're sort of understanding it. Because there's a finite amount that folks can do in formal education. Curriculum can't be filled out anymore. I'm sure all the faculty will tell you that. And so it's going to be up to the students to help do some of that bridging. So just give you sort of broader perspective, we track enrollments and degrees granted in the US. And as you can see, we're near some historic highs in enrollment. It has gone down this past year. We haven't QC'd that 2019 numbers yet. So we are seeing a bit of a dip. Some of that is because we've had about 5,000 or 6,000 majors that are in online only programs. And those programs have been shifting in the schools. They've been birthed out of the geology departments, and they're being shifted over to the online colleges, and it's getting harder for us to track. But we've had a pretty good clip at the undergraduate level. And if you look at the graduate level enrollments, they're pretty flat. And the realities are the grad schools are pretty much at capacity, have been for quite a while. So it is competitive if you're looking to go into grad school. And we're pretty much bouncing around at about that 10,000 mark, which is about the sum. But, that's not to dissuade anyone, but just to understand the realities. When we look at the degrees awarded, as you can imagine, you got some of this growth going on, because we've had the boom in the undergraduate. There is a fair bit of attrition at this point in the last couple of years, as we had a bit of a spike because of, the shale gas plays and a lot of folks wanting to get a geology degree to just go out and work on the rigs. But it's starting to stabilize off. The other thing too, I just want to point out is that you can get these shocks, and the late 80s were shock. And this is right when I graduated and there were literally 0 jobs. You may hear your colleagues and your friends say, oh, there's no jobs out there. You don't know what no jobs is unless you were around in 1989. The question was, were we going to turn the lights off on the profession because it was such a shock? But the reality is things recover, and geology and geoscience evolved. And this growth here was basically the growth of the environmental sector. This was all resources, and then people realized we had a lot to contribute into things like Superfund and other activities. And so, recognize that the profession is dynamic and will change, and be ready to change because your skills are transferable across sectors. So one thing that's been interesting is, so we have been running a exit survey of geology graduates at all degree levels for a while. And this is a diagram showing the different specialty areas that their degrees were in, and then basically the occupational industries that they went to. And as you can see, over the last 10 years, a lot of folks in geology and end up in oil and gas, geophysics, the same way. But as you can see, there's a pretty good chunk sitting over here in environmental science, but there's this diversity. And I think this is what the exciting part is there's folks coming from all kinds of different areas, and they're ending up in all different, parts of the profession. And so, keeping an open mind and recognizing that the traditional bins are changing, and be ready to be flexible. And just to give you an example of some of this dynamic change that we're seeing, so when we look at our bachelor's recipients in their first field of employment over 5 or 6 years here a little bit ago, you can see at the bachelor's level, which is not really the degree of employment traditionally in geoscience. There are some environmental services and federal government. A lot of that is doing field technician work in a lot of cases. Federal government's been hiring a lot because most of their geotechs were actually Vietnam vets, and they're all retiring at the same time. So like the USGS has seen their hydrology techs and their geotechs, retiring at a pretty rapid clip. And so they've been hiring up folks at the bachelor's level to, fill that in. And then the environmental services, they're just consuming human capacity at all levels very consistently. They've been able to move from energy boom to water to a lot of different infrastructure. It's a very dynamic environment. When you look at the master's, this is traditionally the degree of employment if you want to work professionally as a geoscientist. You can see this key thing, though. Oil and gas was the big dog, and it has shrunk. And it has shrunk a lot more from even this last time we ran this survey. And you see the federal government expanding, and you will find that right now, for instance, if you go onto USA Jobs and look for geoscience jobs, there's about 300 positions in the federal government open at almost any given time on a consistent basis. And these things are rolling in and out at a consistent clip because there's a lot of retirements in the federal service. And again, environmental services just plugging along. They're very consistent in their assumption of human capital. And then if you eventually go on to a doctorate, the four-year university and research institute are obviously big consumers of that. A lot of these are postdocs. And, my suggestion is talk to your faculty advisors about what postdocs are like and what that pathway looks like. They do change and evolve. But do recognize that we're seeing things like the environmental services sector actually starting to hire PhDs, which was very rare before. But as their projects have gotten more complex, they've been hiring sort of up the degree level in addition. So something to think about is what the Bureau of Labor Statistics, they like to do their analysis here of the various sort of sub-occupations in geoscience and what the growth levels are. So the 2018-2028, this is pre-COVID, the projected GDP growth would be about 6.3%. And as you can see, geoscience is sort of bobbing in right about that for most of the fields. So pretty much the number of jobs is growing at the proportion of the economy. And some areas, particularly in the environmental, the applied folks, the technical, on the ground folks in the environmental sector is growing at a higher rate. What is the impact of COVID? We're doing a major COVID study on behalf of NSF right now on the impacts of geoscience, and we're not seeing really any substantive negative impact on employment in geoscience. So the only question will be whether or not the economic dip will slow down the hiring in the near term. But our expectation on a horizon of, say, 2028, these numbers, these kinds of percentages are probably going to hold as being fairly reasonable estimates. And then if you look at it and what are the industries that the geoscience demand is going to increase, shows a couple key trends. I mean, one, you see finance and insurance. Actually, geoscientists do go into finance and insurance, usually as investment advisors and analysts. It's a smaller N, and it is growing, but that is certainly reflective of the growth of the finance industry. The one thing I want to point out is some of the transitions. So you see oil and gas extraction dropping 10%, but you see support for mining, and in the federal government, mining includes oil and gas, as well as traditional mining. That's going up 20%. And so what you're seeing are the Exxons and the Shells and the BPs are not the folks that are doing the hiring of geoscientists. It's actually occurring over in their support organizations such as Schlumberger and Halliburton and other technical firms. So when if you're interested in the resource industry, you'll be looking not at the big names that you think of, but actually these consultancies and other service firms. But most geoscientists, and I mean like 75%, fall in this professional science and technical services area. This is environmental consulting and other private firms that are in the area of providing geoscience support, because there's a lot of companies that have one or two geoscientists dealing with specific problems within their operations. But I want to, particularly if you're thinking about going to grad school or if you're in grad school, I'm part of an effort doing looking at graduate education as well and how it maps into the workforce. And one of the sentiments that came out of it was the fact that our current graduate degree recipients are outstanding scientists. They understand science. They can think as a scientist. But one of the challenges that the employers are seeing is they don't actually know how to do anything. And this is where the skills issue comes down to. Is translating all this scientific knowledge, this ability to analyze, but you still actually have to, manipulate, whether it's the data or instrumentation or design projects or what have you. And this was their biggest concern. And we see this echoed at the undergraduate level as well. And so when they're saying they don't know how to do anything, what are the skills? What are the things they're really talking about in particular? And in general, the employers have been happy but regardless of where you're in the geosciences, fundamental geologic understanding is absolutely required. And this is sort of like that core traditional geology curriculum. Let's not lose the paleontology and the SED-strat and the petrology and the geomorph. It's all of those components that you will eventually have to synthesize into systems thinking. The other thing that they worry about is that folks look at those prerequisites in physics and chemistry and biology as more barriers. I just have to do this prereq and move on. And one of their big concerns, we hear this particularly from the environmental firms, is no, you're going to use a lot of that physics and chemistry and biology in application. You're not going to be an expert, but you need to be sufficiently literate as a professional so that you can work with your colleagues in those areas. And so this is one of those other sort of key skills that were flagged. And perhaps the biggest thing, and I'll get into some more detail to sort of show how it flows through the future work, is the ability to work quantitatively. We are in a very data-centric phase of science and in society at large. And this is actually one area where the geosciences are coming up short on average for a lot of the graduates. So something to think about, and we'll get some detail. But the other thing are these co-curricular skills, things that you're probably going to have to go outside of your school to get. Number one hindrance for students, new graduates, to get hired by an environmental firm is they don't have HAZWOPER certification. They can't put you out in the field on a drill site if you don't have all the right credentials. This isn't hard to get. A lot of fire stations provide it. Some schools are starting to add it as options in their curriculum as well. But you have to learn what are those requirements you need in your state where you want to go work to actually go do things. FAA drone license, pilot's license. This actually is very lucrative. I had an intern. He was finishing up and got his drone license. He's actually running the entire drone operations for DNR for Maine now. Everything from search and rescue to environmental assessment to hunting down, illicit, marijuana, plots. But this is one of the key things that's happening in the idea of doing a site assessment, particularly in the environmental field, is you're going to do it remotely. You're going to run a drone. They're getting lots of different sensors. So it's beyond just doing, photography. So the core point is you're going to identify those key areas you really need to go on foot, get on the ground, and do additional analysis. And then programming is becoming important, particularly the ability to interface into all the computational systems. And thinking about GIS and visualization, this is another angle. You work geospatially, and it's part of the communication process as well. So ideally, you can do geospatial analysis, but at bare minimum, be able to communicate in a geospatial area as well. So these have been popped up by the employers as sort of some of their peak concerns for hiring out, particularly for folks coming out with bachelor's degrees. So we're going to talk a little bit about the quantitative one. So one of the key things is in our exit survey, we asked folks to this point in your education, what are the math courses you've taken? And as you can see, most folks sort of make it to Calc 1, maybe Calc 2, and then it drops off. And what's interesting is these folks with the advanced things like linear algebra, diffuse, quantitative methods, that's actually almost a cohort. The individuals that get to that point, they almost all take all of that. And perhaps the thing that is most tragic and very concerning is that we only have 61% of our doctorate recipients who've ever taken a statistics course. That's a very painful thing to see for folks that are having to then support an analysis. So it is important to build these up, and not necessarily for doing the problems. And I think this is one of the key things that came out from the employers. Why do they really like to see folks that have things like differential equations and linear algebra? Well, if you're going to work in fluid systems, differential equations helps you understand what that system looks like, helps you think about advection dispersion and drawdown curves and pressure gradients and all those kinds of issues. They're not really that worried if you can solve a partial, differential system. There's Mathematica and other tools to do that, but it's your ability to understand how the system works. The other argument, linear algebra. If you haven't had linear algebra, you really can't understand how a multivariate system interacts and has feedback mechanisms and the like. Again, you have MATLAB or Octave to do the solutions in linear algebra. That's not the issue, but it's to understand when you're looking at a complex system how that interacts and builds. In the statistics, the data analytics and machine learning space, this is an area I actually spent a lot of time in. It is a glorified set of statistics. It's underpinned by statistical concepts, and without it, it's a little hard to move into this advanced area. I will tell you that when we saw a sudden downturn in the the mining market and in the early part of the sort of the softening in the oil and gas, folks with these stronger quantitative skills, they actually kept their jobs because they were able to be lane shifted within the organization, into other roles, basically putting more of their geology in reserve. So the minerals industry is a classic example. It turns on a dime. It can go from boom to bust in a week. And if you can get lane shifted, you're much more valuable to the company, because the other side of it is it also goes from bust to boom and just as fast. All you have to do is look at what's happening in silver and gold right now. And what that does is whoever is the first out back doing the geology is going to win. And so they're able to shift their workforce back into those roles. So that's something to be thinking about, in these cyclical, systems. So I just want to talk about work moving forward. And there's been lots of papers written on this. None of this is unique to the geosciences, but we have our own pathway. And one of the things I tried to convey to the faculty and to employers, when we think about, like the undergraduate, the current majors are going to be the experienced practicing professionals all the way into the 2060s. And so just as the curriculum I learned on, except for some infusion of, plate tectonics, was largely birthed in the pre-World War II era, it takes a long time for these curriculum to evolve. We need to be thinking about what the later part of the 21st century is going to look like. And we see some examples of how change is handled. So for instance, in 2018, at the end of 2018, GM had a major set of layoffs. And usually you think about car manufacturers are laying off folks in the factories, but that wasn't the case. It was mostly mechanical engineers. And these were folks that were pure play engineers. They knew how to engineer internal combustion engine cars. The problem was they viewed that there was going to be a migration to electric vehicles and new kinds of drivetrains. The issue of material management and the circular economy was a big problem. These are folks that knew aluminum, cast aluminum, and steel, and weren't thinking about carbon fiber or other additional alloys. And so they were not able to adapt to the change in the science and engineering work. And so those folks were laid off, where some of the folks that were more flexible and agile, stayed on. So, these are the kinds of transitions that happen. They seem to be big shocks, but this is just exactly how the system works. And we saw it, in 2007 at an AGU, we had a town hall, and there was a big conversation about how there was a clear labor gap coming because of retirements of baby boomers. And that the fact that whoever put forward the way to solve that labor gap was going to win. They were going to really benefit. And to be honest with you, we thought it was going to be the civil engineers or the actuarial folks, that can do risk assessment. The reality is, in a lot of ways, the statisticians won that battle, because if you look at economic activity, which equates to jobs, there is a certain amount of demand for geoscience. So that would be this dashed line. Certain amount will be done by geoscientists. Certain amount is done by substitution by, say, a civil engineer or whoever might be available. Some just won't be accomplished, and that's the foregone activity. This is always a big issue in the resource industry. But then innovation makes people more efficient, and so therefore is a multiplier for the geoscientists or the substitution. And the reality is, some of the dynamics that are going on in applying machine learning to geoscience is actually that innovation that is becoming as they would call it, a force multiplier. And then that's further complicated in the fact that we need a different vernacular for how we talk about our sectors. We always had oil and gas and mining, environmental. And actually geoscience has a role that's bigger in energy across the petroleum sector, obviously, but renewables, carbon sequestration, you can name it. It has a broad role there. In mining, it's really raw materials. It's about the circular economy. The folks in Europe are way ahead of us here in the US thinking about this, but there are some amazing geochemistry problems in the recycling space right now that the traditional chemists have struggled on, but are sort of classic, or geochemistry kinds of problems. And environmental, it's actually about professional services. It's a lot more dynamic than just going out and doing water quality testing. It's infrastructure, it's hazards mitigation, it's consulting, it's managing water supplies. It's a very diverse field. And they have, as I sort of showed with the broad employment that's consistent, they've been very agile as an industry in finding their roles, sort of regardless of the economic activity. And so I think one of the key things to understand, particularly if you look at the resource sector, geoscience employ a lot of folks go into geology, particularly if they're interested in resources, sort of looking at the pointy end, the exploration and sort of the exotic. And the reality is those jobs have all moved downstream in the resource sector. And you saw that basically about 8 years ago, when about 100,000 people, geoscientists and engineers globally, lost their jobs in the mining industry because automation, because they had discovered reserves that are going to keep us for a long time. The pointy end had disappeared, and these were not people that were adjusting to the changes. Because the real challenges, the geologic problems, are in production, distribution, retirement of resource sites, co-production, issues like that. And so the boom that we saw in employment in geoscience recently in the US because of shale gas was actually a coupling. There were people that were working the oil and gas side, but there were just as many people working the environmental side. And the University of Pittsburgh, I had I think it was the department chair there, was talking about how almost all of his graduates ended up working for the exact same company, though a bunch were interested in the resources, a bunch in the environmental, and they said they were fundamentally doing the same job, but the titles were different because it was this universe of problems of, wastewater management and, and fluid injection, and seismic stability and all these kinds of broad topics that were being applied. So again, the geoscience moving across various areas. But one of the things I want to sort of point out is, in the quantitative space and things like machine learning. So there was a good example, good case study here in the mining So a number of the major mining companies wanted to see what did their geoscientists do. And their study showed between 80 and 82% of the time geoscientists were actually spending managing data, searching, cleaning, prepping it. The big energy companies did the same thing. They found it was 79%. And you'll find the data science people will come up with that 80-20 rule as well. And Goldcorp, before they got acquired, they joined up with IBM, spent $1 billion actually with IBM to try to use machine learning to address this, because geoscientists are not, that's not what their value is in managing data. Their value is in thinking as a geoscientist. And they recognize that machine learning is basically pattern matching. And so much of our science is exactly that. It is pattern matching and identification, particularly stuff that you have to plow through. And even some simple machine learning processes like kernel vector machines are really good at solving these problems. We see these used for looking at core photos for classification, or working through thin sections and things like that. And we're taking yet another level with a convoluted neural net to sort of get through all that sort of drudgery so you can solve the geologic problems. And so the thought process that Goldcorp had was, if we don't want to get rid of the geoscientists, but if they can spend 50% of their time, we have a lot more geologic intellect going after solving much harder problems. And so this was their goal. And so after they came up with this, worked with IBM, they had a contrived problem, and they saw a 35-fold decrease in solution time using Watson than their senior geoscientist team that was having to deal with managing the data. People are slow doing that. And then, behold, they had their first time real world problem. Their board wanted, I think it was, they wanted every prospect that they had in Ontario, they wanted a average gold concentration estimate from each location, or it was something along those lines. And they had their they thought, great, well, we're going to try this. And so their senior geoscience team took 1,080 person hours to actually solve this and present it. It took Watson 14 minutes. Nothing about that problem is geologically, intellectually challenging. It was just plowing through data. The real point would be why, and spending that time thinking about, the geology so that they can be predictive and or identify better options. So the big thing is, you'll hear people talk about machine learning as a threat, and you'll hear a lot about that in the science. And it's really not. There is nobody in the data side of machine learning that is actually trying to replace the scientist. It is actually going after this data manipulation issue. And so we need to evolve, and we need to understand that things like being a well logger and a stratigraphic interpreter and things like, they're disappearing. They're going away. Those are occupation. Those are tasks that are being eliminated by machine learning. But that's actually not necessarily why you were learning geology. And what the vision is that we're moving to an augmented geoscientist. And the point is that you can focus on these domain problems and or the tools to improve on this. And so the impacts are actually interesting. How is work done? Well, we can go back and you can see each of the domains were sort of separate. I would argue that the university environment is more at that second, the interdisciplinary collaboration where folks are talking and touching, but not necessarily tightly integrated. There's some of that happening at the university level, but it's challenging, particularly across departments and funding sources and things like that. If you move into the industry, they've been working with integrated teams for quite a while, where you have an engineer, geologist, a geophysicist, data person, whatever, and they're thrown a problem and then they collaborate. But what the companies have moved to, some are pretty well down the line, some of the mining companies especially, but the oil companies and definitely the environmental firms, is what they want is a well-balanced geoscientist, and they want a team of them that can speak with literacy across all these fields to collaborate, so that what they're really doing is building up diversity of thought, not diversity of background. And they're finding that to be much more effective. And so when you envision yourself coming out, And what the employers are looking for is something like this, your spectrum. You have literacy across this wide range, whatever your background prepares you for, this wide range of fields. And you're going to have areas where you particularly excel, like this. Maybe you have an engineering aptitude, and you're really into the geology, or it could be rock mechanics and business, or whatever kinds of spectrum you're looking at. And their idea is they want people with these different spectra together and use that complementary set plus the diversity of thought as a process to solve a lot harder problems. So making sure that you have that broad background is critical. And what this does, and what we're seeing, is a fundamental change in the way labor is organized. And again, we're seeing this in the resources industry. I think it's actually sort of existed in the environmental sector for a while, but not necessarily well defined. But what people were in their silos, geology or geophysics or whatever, and there were sort of skills. There were a lot of people with sort of basic skills, doing very technical work, moving up the seismic interpreters to maybe the senior analysts. And the machine learning is sort of wiping out that middle skill space. And one can say, okay, that's not good. But if we look at it differently, and this is the best I've been able to come up with, is that you sort of have these end members and then lots in between of people that are the big thinkers. They're the intellectual problem solvers that can think geologically and are working in these teams to solve the geologic problems and build those geologic models, all the way over to a space where you have these diverse skill sets of geoscientists. They understand the geoscience. They maybe are prone to have interest in engineering, the data side. So they're really the ones that are the makers. They're building sensors. They're building data acquisition systems. They're the ones that are talking about what the geologic problems are at the very high level, and then how do we actually enhance and build that data stream to try to tackle it. And we see this like within the drone space as we've moved from just photography to doing hyperspectral and gas chromatography, all kinds of stuff within it, because folks have been talking about the science problems and now how do we meet the data. And you don't do that just simply talking to an electrical engineer. It's this integration component. So this is sort of I think the exciting thing is to look at it as a different kind of continuum. Within sort of the science space, where you go from data to knowledge to, data to information to knowledge, and where people are putting their maximum effort in that pathway. And so I just sort of want to wrap up with what I think is one of the best quotes, and I think it's true. With every retirement, we destroy a geoscience job, and with every new hire, we're creating a geoscience job we can't even begin to describe. The new hires will define these jobs of the future. And so this was the head of exploration for BHP. And this was in 2018. And to give you a sense of the dynamics that are going on, at that meeting, 30,000 people in the mining industry, I was one of the youngest people at that meeting. In 2019, I was one of the oldest, because there is this major transition that's occurring. Mining's actually a little bit earlier than oil and gas, but they're turning over a lot. And even the environmental sector, which sort of had a later start, they're starting to see that turn. And it's the skill set that folks are bringing and this dynamic thought process that we're not going to have those old stovepipes and titles that folks have been used to and maybe have heard through the classes. But it's going to be up to you to find what your spectrum of skills are and your interests and how you're going to apply your geoscience knowledge in to define those jobs. And we're finding employers are recognizing this. They're not necessarily setting up little boxes that they're going to fit you in. They're looking at where you plug into a much more complex system, realizing you're going to grow part of that system. So it's actually a very exciting time with all the uncertainty with COVID and everything. The key thing is to build up that spectrum of science, your spectrum of science. Those quantitative skills are very important, but so are the communications skills, and don't always be chasing the little niche. If you can speak with a lot of literacy across a wide range of components, particularly in things like the environmental sector where you don't know. You may have to do mineralogy one day, some paleontology the other day, and hydrology on another. To be able to pull on that core component, is a real advantage and will ensure your employment and your long-term growth. So happy to take any questions.
Thank you. That was fabulous. I feel like I have so many questions, but I want to make sure certainly that the students have time to ask questions, but I'll just open it up to anyone now. I can't necessarily see everyone in the gallery. Maybe Chris, you could stop sharing so I could
Sure, absolutely.
Everyone a little bit, and then if we need to go back to a slide, we can.
There we go.
Yeah, that's better. So you can just, raise your hand if you have a question, or unmute yourself, maybe. I can't, let's see, I don't see.
I have a question.
Absolutely.
Yeah, Hannah.
So basically at the beginning you, what's the word I'm looking for? Emphasized, I think that's the right word. You emphasize that kind of the higher degree you have, the better chance you have of being hired. Would you recommend going to graduate school before you apply for a job, or do you think you should try to apply with the BS first and then go if it doesn't work out, or do you think we should go straight to a master's degree or something before we even start applying?
That's gonna, it's gonna be sound like a cop out. It sort of depends on your individual circumstance. I will tell you this: so you'll get good experience, if you can land a job with a bachelor's. Understand it's challenging. One of the key things though is understand that you need to go on for that master's. Now, whether it's straight out of school or not, that's really sort of depends on your circumstance. So in the environmental field, when I work with the people with AIPG who are mostly in the environmental sector, their biggest challenge, because there's not really a lot of production at geotechs. And so they hire a lot of bachelor's recipients, sort of fill that role, out in the field, collecting data, doing some basic analysis. That's great. And if that new hire is interested in taking the educational component to go on to a master's and continue developing, they're a good employee and they're going to thrive. Their problem is the ones that aren't interested in taking additional classes. After about 3 years, they're very expensive for what they are. And a lot of them sort of then get laid off. And so recognizing that you will want to get a master's, you'll have to look at your own situation, whether you do the long haul, or try to jump off. But most employers have educational support. And so it's a great way if you can't get direct funded support in a graduate program, which is hard at just the master's level, to have someone else help pay for that work.
So it would be okay, or at least part of what you're saying is that if you happen to get a job as a Bachelor of Science, but you expressed that you wanted to go on to a master's, basically you're saying that if it's something they would want, that they think would benefit them, they would support you and you could keep your job while you're trying to get a master's?
A lot of employers, this is part of the benefits and the negotiation process of a job, but a lot of employers do have education benefits to some level. And particularly, it's expensive to hire and fire. And so it's cheaper usually to bring someone in, help them get to the next level, because then the value goes way up as well. So it's often cheaper. So it's a conversation you need to have with your prospective employer, before you accept a job.
All right, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Samantha? Yeah.
Okay, so at the very beginning of this, you mentioned that throughout our schooling, we're not always going to be challenged to apply the knowledge that we've learned through these new situations. And I know that you mentioned that there are some different certifications that we can get to further prepare ourselves for our jobs after, outside of our curriculum. But during our curriculum, what other steps can we be taking to make sure that we are challenged as individuals to apply these things? And what kind of situations can we get ourselves into?
So, I mean, I think the big ones that certainly any employers that have come from a geoscience background will look for senior theses are huge. They really are. They're the consulting field loves them. They actually use them as primary sources, particularly if you do something that is local. You're not using someone else's data, but finding a more local project that you've managed through that, and that you help work with the faculty member design a project, but build some skills, additional skills. That's applying what you've learned. REUs obviously are huge, and Fulbrights and things like that. Any of those opportunities where you can do some additional research is a really good way to do that. Internships are obviously great. A little hard in COVID land. We've done, we had a bunch of our policy ones, interns that were done remotely, but if hopefully with life, hopefully we'll return to normal, things like that. And state agencies tend to have a lot. And if you're at a school that has an engineering college, I would wander over there, because most engineers are required to do internships in the summer. And a lot of those internships also are available for physical science students. So, it's worth looking at it, because there's just not that natural connection yet between undergraduates and the employers for NGO for the internship. So sometimes there's a little end run around, to get some of those experiences.
Okay, thank you.
I want to just jump in, because on the chat, people have been asking for the recording, and I'm happy to share the recording. And I've written down most of your names, but my email is in the invite that Brandon Jones sent. So if you send me a note, I can make sure you get the recording. I don't know about the PowerPoint slides, if you're able to share those. Oh, perfect.
I'll be happy to send them on to you, Sharon, if you want to.
Okay, that'd be great. Then
Awesome.
I can distribute them widely. Yeah. I'll jump in with a question. So I was actually really happy to see the certifications that you listed, because for our GeoPath scholars, we're going to give them the opportunity, if they want, to take HAZWOPER training. Excellent. And to do actually a drone, to get a drone pilot license as well, because we have a certified license on our project team, which is great.
Nice.
I was kind of curious about whether there's been any discussion about digital badges, which we have done at our university, which is more like a micro credential, right? And has that come up at all with employers? Because we are developing some digital badges.
Yeah, I mean, yes, and I think one of the big things that's going to come out in the Vision and Change project is courses are very hard from an employer standpoint to understand what they mean. And so part of the call is to actually decompose, courses into learning objectives, and even into sub skills. And then the idea that these are the skills that you have. So for instance, Northern Arizona University is way out ahead on this, not in geo, but in some of their other fields, because at that time, when they started, Facebook and Google were huge employers of their students, and they really did not care about what courses they took. They wanted to see a portfolio of skills, and whether it was through badges or other certifications or a transcript that laid them out, they wanted to know what folks knew. And so things like badges that certify that, I think, are very valuable. You have to, the trick is to find ways to convey it to the employer. You have, the key thing, that just occurred is the president signed an order, and I don't see this one changing regardless of the election, that is stripping the hiring priority process of federal jobs from being degree-based to skills-based. And so, if you, and this will open up a lot of things that if you don't have a license, but you actually have developed that whole portfolio of skills that may have otherwise, because of some semantic, was not then accessible. So, it is important. The employers recognize it's important. There's different levels that they've gotten to it. And I think, the other big thing that we're trying to stress in Vision and Change is to encourage students to develop a professional development portfolio that they can then share with an employer, so they can see projects they've done, the badges, any of those kinds of assets, whether it's a senior thesis or inside a class, I've been able to do this programming, or, yes, I, mapped a quad, or whatever it might be. That is simply additional ammo in the application process, as students move forward. And I think it also helps remember what their sales points are, as they look at jobs and go, well, I have this, and they can stress that. So, this is where we're going, and we're trying. Other fields are way ahead of us, and we're trying to get the geo community, more fully embracing it on a consistent basis.
So I think that's part of the answer to Samantha's question too. So as you're going through your courses, students think about, what are some tangible skills or products that you created or you learned in the courses, and pulling those out into a portfolio that can be shared.
And it could be something small. I mean, it could be a specific lab write-up that you did, all the way to, maybe there was an in-class project or term paper. I think keeping those as a portfolio so that you have them and it can be demonstrated only helps your situation.
Mm-hmm. How about other questions? All right, well, I think that was sufficient wait time. I didn't hear anyone. I really want to thank you, Chris. I learned so much. I think actually every geoscience student should hear some of this. The report that you mentioned that the 1,000 people have contributed to, so that's coming out, or it is out?
It's coming out. We're in final external review on it, so it will be sent to every department, we're hoping, by October 1st. As a hard copy, and Sharon Mosier at UT and myself will be sort of doing a virtual roadshow for departments and faculty, and sort of about what the findings were and the suggestions and the resources with that. And we're building a toolkit also with tools for students. Part of this is the students holding the departments accountable, and part of it is actually guiding on things like professional portfolios, and as basically a competency skills matrix mapping process. So some tools to help the students do that as well, because one of the key things too, and I encourage the students, as you encounter, like if you can interface them with alumni, developing sort of what are the skills that they had and when did they develop them, because they become pathways for folks to understand what they're eventually going to have to learn, do, accomplish, maybe to get to some destinations that they're interested in. So yeah, we're hoping by October 1st it will be published and out. And like I said, every department will get a hard copy, and we'll be blasting out PDF copies and everything for folks en masse.
That sounds very exciting and useful. Did you have a question, Zai? See? Oh, you're on mute.
Okay. Yeah. First, thank you, Sharon, for organizing this, and Chris, that's a great presentation. You will do a virtual tour of something like this. I think it would be wonderful if you can talk to our department colloquium, because we're in the process to revisit curriculum. Mm-hmm. I think this information here, updated information, is very important for faculty and understand what kind of curriculum we wish to provide for students.
Yeah.
So if you, is that okay with you, and I'll let my assistant chair to contact you to
absolutely
time.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what we're looking for.
All right. Well, it's just about 1 p.m. here in near St. Louis, where we are. So I want to thank everyone for coming, and especially thank you, Chris.
Yep.
It was really fantastic. So
thanks.
Virtual class. All right, thank you, GeoPaths colleagues and GeoPaths scholars. And I will see the scholars next week, and hopefully the GeoPaths, my GeoPaths colleagues as well.
Sharon?
Oh,
Sharon, I don't think I can make next week's.
okay, that's fine. Thanks for
Sorry,
letting me know.
yeah, something came up. Something came up and I'm not gonna be able to make it next week.
Thank you for letting me know, Hannah.
Yeah, no problem.
Okay.
All right, bye
All right,
everyone.
thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you, Dr. Keane.
Yep, my pleasure.
All right, who started recording? Was it you, Manny?
I did, yes.
All right, so then, because I'm looking and I can't quite, can you stop the recording?